In this video, I'm going to show you how you can finish adding colour to your puppets using three main processes. Process 1 is sanding with fine sandpaper. This helps to bring out the texture of the carving, giving the finished puppet a slightly antiqued look, which is a little bit more interesting and a little bit less flat in colour. Process 2, adding areas of white paint with either chalk paint or milk paint. And process 3, sealing the pieces with Danish oil. The Danish oil helps to fix the water-based dyes into the wood. This means that they won't run if the puppet gets a bit wet, so it adds a level of water resistance. It also adds an extra depth and lustre to the colours, which I really like. So, for this video, there are three main things you will need, and I introduced them all in video 3. You will also find them on the kit list, which you can download from my website on the tutorials page. The three things are milk paint, or you can use chalk paint, or white acrylic if you'd prefer, Danish oil, and fine sandpaper. I use wet and dry sandpaper, and here I'm using 1200 grit, which is very, very fine. You could use 1000 or 800, just not super coarse sandpaper. In this video, I'll be demonstrating with both the goldfinch and the swallow puppet. Here's a quick recap of all the pieces. This is the swallow body, after the water-based dyes have dried. This is the swallow tail. And here are the swallow wings. This is the goldfinch body. And the goldfinch wings. And the goldfinch tail. Process 1. Sanding. You could also call this process distressing. Start by tearing your sandpaper into small squares. Use gentle circular motions with the sandpaper. You don't need to sand the entire puppet. I'll show you what I did for each bird. The belly is a good place to start. Here you can see the texture of the carving emerging where it's been sanded. For the swallow body, I sanded the belly, the back, and the back of the head. I also used the sandpaper to highlight the upper beak. Sometimes you may wish to restain areas if you feel you've removed too much colour. For example, here I've restained the centre of the back. For the swallow wings, I used the sandpaper to highlight the edges of the feathers. I reworked some wood dye into the top corners to keep the rich colour. I did lots of sanding on the underside of the wings, as bird wings are usually paler on the underside. For the swallowtail, I sanded the top to bring out the textures. And I highlighted the feathers on the underside. For the goldfinch body, I sanded the belly. Creating lots of textures and highlights on the surface. I also used the sandpaper to highlight the upper beak. I actually restained the back with brown because I preferred it as a block colour. For the goldfinch wings, I used the sandpaper to highlight all the feathers on the top side. But I left the corners dark brown, with a bit of texture in the middle. I did lots of sanding on the underside of the wings to make them paler than the top side. For the goldfinch tail, the sanding was very minimal. And I even decided to restain most of the top side to keep the dark colour. Process 2. Painting in the white areas. If you've recently reapplied any of the water-based stains, you will need to leave those to dry first before applying white paint. Ideally, you'll want to leave them overnight to dry, or at least the best part of a day. Mix up your milk or chalk paint to a thick paste, about the same thickness as acrylic paint. For the swallow, apply the white to the underside of the wings and tail. This doesn't need to be a solid white. You can leave areas of the undercoat showing through, which adds a bit of depth and texture. However, you may want to apply a second coat to the centre of each piece, as it can dry a little bit translucent. This will mean it's a nice, vibrant white. For the swallow body, apply the white sparingly to the swallow's belly. Use a minimal amount of paint on your brush and build it up gradually. Flick your brush back and forth to pick up on the highlights and textures in the surface of the wood. This technique is called dry brushing. I built up the paint until the centre of the belly was solid white, but the edges still showed the undercoat and the carved texture. For the goldfinch head, apply the white as a solid colour. This might take 2 coats, depending on the consistency of the paint. For the goldfinch beak, you can apply the paint a bit more sparingly so some of the undercoat shows through, especially in the centre of the beak. Finally, for both the swallowtail and the goldfinch tail, you'll want to paint in the tail markings. You'll probably need to apply 2 to 3 coats to get a nice bright white. You can draw them in first, or you can paint them straight on. Use your reference sheet as a guide. The tail markings are on both the top side and the underside of the tail. Process 3. Sealing the wood with Danish oil. You will need to leave the white paint to dry before you begin this final step. Milk paint is very quick to dry, so is acrylic paint or chalk paint. You'll notice that it's touch dry well within an hour, and you certainly don't need to leave it overnight like the wood dyes. Adding oil to the pieces is a very simple process. Using a brush, apply the oil generously to the surface of the piece, making sure to cover all areas of the surface. You will see that the oil soaks into the wood, rather than sitting on the surface like a varnish. After about 10 minutes, you can remove any excess oil by soaking it up with a cloth. Just rub the cloth gently over the surface of the wood. It's a good idea to do this because if you do leave any excess oil on the surface, it can dry shiny like a varnish. It's particularly important to remove any excess oil from white paint areas, like the swallow's belly. Milk paint is very porous paint, which means the oil can soak through it, but not as quickly as onto bare wood. This means there will be more excess oil to remove from the white areas. You will want to apply oil to all of your puppet pieces. When you've finished, you can leave them to dry overnight. This concludes how to add colour to your puppets. In the next video, I'll begin the assembly of the puppets. Here is some footage of all the puppet pieces after the Danish oil is dried, ready for assembly.